In this video, I'll show you how I made some cherry veneer and applied it to an MDF core to create 2 plywood panels for a project that I'm working on. The project is a display case. These panels will be both the top and the bottom of that display case. The reason I made my own veneer and panels for this project is I wanted the veneer to be a lot thicker than what you can get if you were to buy veneer. The veneer you buy is so thin you really can't sand it or work with it at all. And just the way it's going to be assembled and glued up into this project, I wanted to have the stability of the MDF core with the workability of the 1/8 inch veneer panels. So before we get started, I wanted to mention that I'm doing this just in my small wood shop with really modest tools. I just have a 10-inch bandsaw benchtop model, and I don't have a drum sander at all, so I'm going to use my thickness planer to surface the veneer after I resaw it on the bandsaw. And then finally I'll glue it all up to the MDF core using a makeshift veneer press that I put together. So let's get started. I start with a 2 foot by 4 foot piece of 1/2 inch MDF and a couple of pieces of 3/4 inch thick cherry. First, I cut the pieces of cherry to the rough length that I want the veneer to be. The maximum resaw capacity in my bandsaw is 5 inches, so I trimmed down each board to the width of 5 inches on the table saw. Then I use the joiner to make sure that both edges are straight and clean, because both edges will become jointed edges in the final veneer. To get the bandsaw ready, I want to make sure that the fence is set to the same angle as the blade will kind of naturally want to cut. It's called the drift angle. To determine that angle, I mark a line parallel to one edge on a scrap piece of wood, and then just freehand cut down that line on the bandsaw. And when I feel like I have a nice straight cut going, then I just turn off the bandsaw and using a pencil to mark a line on the table, and this is the drift angle. Now I can adjust my fence to match this pencil mark line on the table. The final thickness of the veneer I want is about 1/8 of an inch, so I'm going to cut each slice at about 3/16 of an inch. To set my fence, I use a 3/16 inch drill bit so that it just barely touches the teeth of the blade. I make the resaw cut with the help of a dual feather board to hold the workpiece up against the fence. I'm using a 1/2 inch blade with 4 teeth per inch, and it's working pretty good. Although I have to move really slow since it's kind of pushing my little benchtop bandsaw to its limit. Before making the next resaw cut on the same piece of wood, I clean up the just cut surface on the joiner so that each piece has at least one plain flat side after being cut on the bandsaw. And then I go back to the bandsaw with another resaw cut for the next slice. So after all the pieces are cut, this is what I have. It's a bunch of pieces that have one cleanly planed side and the other side is a rough cut from the bandsaw. Since I don't have a drum sander, I'm going to run these thin veneer pieces through my planer to clean up that rough side. My planer claims to be able to go as thin as 1/8 of an inch, which is my target thickness, but I don't want to push the planer to its limit and just feel a little safer using a sled. Plus, the sled will help reduce or really eliminate any snipe from the planer. I made this sled by starting with a piece of plywood about 12 inches wide and 3 feet long and glued on some solid pieces of pine. It's important to note that I oriented the grain on these running parallel to the sled direction, since the planer blades will actually interact with these pieces of wood. These end blocks will probably reduce the slipping of the workpiece, but the real benefit of both the end blocks as well as the shepherd pieces along each side is to eliminate the planer snipe on the ends of the pieces of veneer. I apply some paste wax to the bottom of the sled just to help it slide smoothly through the planer. After the glue is dry, then I test out the sled on a scrap piece of wood, and also it planes down the end blocks to just less than 3/16 of an inch. They need to be at least as thin or thinner than my starting thickness of the wood that I'm wanting to plane, but thicker than the final target thickness that I'm wanting to plane it to. So the sled's big enough to plane 2 pieces of veneer at the same time. I'm just making multiple shallow passes until all of the bandsaw marks are removed and all of the pieces are the same thickness. And just to keep all the pieces the same thickness, I adjust the depth on each pass only after all 6 have been through the planer, so I end up with the same exact thickness on all pieces. I'm shooting for about 1/8 of an inch thick, and this is pretty close, so I'm happy to stop just a little bit thicker. Okay, so now I have 6 pieces of veneer that are all exactly 5 inches wide, 20 inches long, and 1/8 inch thick. An advantage of making your own veneer instead of buying some is that you have the ability to control the grain pattern. Although the grain on these pieces really isn't anything special, but still I want to arrange it to look nice. And then I just mark it with a big V so that I can keep track of it when gluing it up. So now that the veneer is all ready, I just cut the MDF down to rough size of the 2 panels that I'm creating, which is 15 inches by 20 inches. Okay, it's time to do the glue up. To get started, I butt the edges of the veneer together, and then using blue tape that I kind of stretch across the seam, and then a strip of blue tape down the length of the seam. So then I just turn it over and I can open up each joint and fill it with a small little bead of wood glue. And then after laying it back flat, I just wipe off the excess glue and the seams are glued up. The next step is to apply a layer of glue to the MDF. I'm using a glue roller. It helps to make sure that the layer of glue is pretty uniform across the MDF. And I just apply the glue to the MDF, not the veneer. I'm using melamine for the outer shell, or the caul. It's called the clamping caul of the veneer press. And a wax paper layer, and then lay down the veneer and then the MDF. And then just repeat the process for the other side of the panel. Some may recommend that you use battens with a bow in them just to make sure there's good clamping pressure in the center of the veneer press and to start the pressure in the center and work outwards just in case there are any air bubbles. But an alternative is just to tape some thin pieces of wood in the center of each batten. These are about 1/16 of an inch thick and 3 to 4 inches in length. Here's a quick demo on the edge of my workbench just to show how the batten will bend under the clamping pressure, and so there'll be pressure applied to both the center and the edges of the batten. So at this point it's just a matter of putting a lot of clamps on. And just taking a look here, after all the clamps are on, there are essentially 4 pressure points for each row of clamps and 5 rows of clamps, so a total of 20 pressure points over a 15 inch by 20 inch area. After letting the glue dry overnight, then the clamps can come off. And note that I used the same veneer press and the same glue up process for the second panel, just not showing it here on the video just to keep the length of this video from getting too out of control. After just a light sanding, it's looking pretty good. The seams are really tight and overall these panels look really nice. Then I just cut the panels down to the final size for the project that I'm working on. So that was quite a bit of work. However, I think the result was really worth the effort. These MDF core panels with 1/8 inch veneer on each side should have the best of both the stability of the MDF and the workability of solid wood. I use these panels as the top and bottom panels on this curved front display case that I'm making. I'll include a link to the build video for that display case. Thanks so much for watching, and if you think I've earned it, it'd be great if you hit that thumbs up like button and consider subscribing.